A wealthy tycoon's arrogance became his undoing when he challenged a housekeeper he'd overlooked for years. The millionaire never expected his dismissive dare would expose his own limitations and forever change the power dynamic between them. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The laughter in Richard Hamilton's mahogany-paneled office cut through the evening air like shattered crystal. The CEO of Hamilton Technologies leaned back in his leather chair, a smirk playing across his face as he held up a thick dossier covered in intricate Chinese characters. Around him, board members in expensive suits chuckled, their faces flushed, from the champagne they'd been drinking to celebrate their latest acquisition. "Claire, come here for a moment," Richard called out, his voice dripping with amusement. Claire Thompson paused her quiet work of collecting empty glasses from the sideboard. 20 years of service had taught her to move like a shadow through rooms where important people made important decisions, never drawing attention to herself. She approached with practiced deference, hands folded in front of her uniform. "Yes, Mr. Hamilton?" Richard waved the document dramatically, eliciting more laughter from his colleagues. "Our translation team says this contract will take at least 3 days to decipher properly. Critical stuff, potentially worth billions." His eyes narrowed with mischief. "But I've got a proposition for you." The wealthy executive glanced around the room, ensuring he had an audience. "Translate this by tomorrow morning, and my entire salary for the year is yours. That's $500,000. He extended the document toward her, his challenge hanging in the air between them. Claire felt every eye in the room boring into her. The humiliation burned deep in her chest, but her face remained impassive, a skill perfected through decades of enduring casual cruelty disguised as humor. "What do you say?" Richard pressed, his voice loud enough to ensure everyone heard. "Think a maid can outdo our experts?" Diane Sterling, the CFO, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but said nothing. The other executives maintained their amused expressions, complicit in their silence. Claire's fingers closed around the edge of the dossier, the weight of it familiar in ways none of them could possibly understand. 20 years ago, before she became invisible, before she became Claire Thompson, she had been someone else entirely. "I'll do my best, sir," she replied softly, her dignity intact despite the mockery surrounding her. As she accepted the document, the room erupted in fresh laughter. Richard raised his glass in a mock toast to Claire, our newest linguistic expert. The air in the boardroom grew thick with tension and privilege. Claire held the dossier close to her chest, feeling the weight of their assumptions pressing down on her shoulders. What had begun as an evening's cruel entertainment now balanced precariously between a joke and something far more dangerous. A trap that could expose everything she had worked so hard to hide. Claire Thompson's hands trembled as she accepted the dossier, the weight of the Chinese document feeling impossibly heavy, the expensive paper crinkled beneath her fingers as laughter rippled through the ballroom. Every snicker, every smirk from Richard Hamilton's board members sliced through. Her dignity like knives. "Look at her face," someone whispered, not quite quietly enough. "Does she even know what language it is?" Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting prismatic light across faces flushed with expensive wine and privilege. In this realm of power and wealth, Claire was nothing but the punchline to a billionaire's cruel joke. 20 years of service, reduced to this moment of humiliation. She stared at the dense Chinese characters, feeling dozens of eyes boring into her. The mansion's grand ballroom, where she'd served countless guests without ever being truly seen, now felt suffocating. Richard lounged in his chair, champagne glass dangling between manicured fingers, his amusement barely concealed behind a veneer of professional detachment. "Well?" he prompted, eyebrows raised. "Are you accepting my generous offer? Or shall I find someone more qualified?" A few executives chuckled, their expensive suits rustling as they shifted in anticipation of her retreat. Diane Sterling, the CFO, remained silent, her expression unreadable as she watched the scene unfold. Claire's initial instinct was to bow her head, to retreat to the kitchen where she belonged in their eyes. But something deep within her, something buried for decades, stirred to life. She lifted her gaze slowly, deliberately, until her eyes locked with Richard's. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees as Claire's shame transformed into something else entirely. A quiet, steely resolve that straightened her spine and steadied her hands. "I accept your challenge, Mr. Hamilton," she said, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the ambient noise of clinking glasses and murmured conversations. "Your salary against my translation by tomorrow morning." Richard's smile faltered momentarily, caught off guard by her confidence. He hadn't expected acceptance, merely entertainment at her expense. "Your entire year's compensation," Claire continued, tucking the dossier carefully under her arm. "I believe that's what you offered." A cold ripple moved through the assembled executives. The joke had somehow shifted, though none could quite identify how or why. The maid's quiet dignity made their laughter seem suddenly crass, inappropriate. "Well then," Richard finally replied, raising his glass in mock salute, "to impossible challenges." Claire nodded once, then turned and walked toward the door, her steps measured and deliberate. For the first time in 20 years, she left the room not as a servant, but as someone who had claimed her own power. The laughter faded as Claire Thompson left the boardroom, her footsteps heavy on the expensive carpet that stretched down the hallway of Hamilton Technologies. Each step reminded her of the vast gulf between her world and theirs, between service and power, invisibility and prominence. The echo of Richard's mockery followed her like a shadow as she made her way back to the kitchen, her sanctuary in this opulent mansion. Alone among the gleaming countertops and high-end appliances, Claire placed the Chinese dossier on the table. The characters swam before her eyes, blurring as 2 decades of memories flooded her mind. She gripped the edge of the marble counter, steadying herself as the weight of years pressed down on her shoulders. She had been so much more than just a maid in this household. Claire had rocked Richard's children to sleep during fevers when he was away on business trips. She had held his wife's hand through chemotherapy treatments, wiping tears and offering comfort when the family patriarch was too busy building his empire. She remembered birthdays when others forgot, prepared favorite meals that brought smiles to troubled faces, and picked up broken pieces of family drama that no one else noticed. Yet they had rendered her invisible. Claire recalled countless dinner parties where she'd moved like a ghost among the wealthy and powerful, refilling glasses and clearing plates, while conversations flowed around her as if she were merely furniture. How many times had Richard discussed business strategies in front of her, assuming her incapable of understanding? How often had guests referred to her in the third person while she stood right beside them? The Chinese contract stared back at her from the kitchen table, its characters no longer foreign to her eyes. Claire ran her fingers over the pages, feeling a familiar stirring in her mind. Knowledge she had buried deep, an identity she had been forced to abandon. Tonight, something had changed. Richard Hamilton's cruelty had struck a different chord, not just another humiliation to endure, but a spark igniting something long dormant. The public mockery had cracked open a vault inside her that had remained sealed for years. Claire straightened her back and looked at her reflection in the polished steel of the refrigerator. The woman who stared back was not just a maid anymore. She was someone who had once commanded lecture halls, published papers, and earned respect in academic circles around the world. "Enough," she whispered to herself, her voice steady and resolute in the empty kitchen. This challenge would be different. This time, the silence that had protected her for 20 years would finally be broken, and nothing in the Hamilton household would ever be the same again. Claire's hands trembled as she stared at the Chinese characters. In the quiet of her small, Quarters at the back of the Hamilton mansion, memories she'd locked away for years, came flooding back. She wasn't always Claire Thompson, the invisible maid who moved silently through the halls of the wealthy. 20 years ago, she had been Dr. Michelle Carter, one of the most respected linguists at Princeton University. Her colleagues had marveled at her ability to decode complex language patterns across Asian dialects. Her published works had revolutionized the field. Students had lined up outside her office door, eager for her guidance. She had been someone who mattered. The framed doctorate diploma she kept hidden beneath her bed was the only physical reminder of that life. Claire pulled it out now, running her fingers over the embossed letters of her real name. The prestigious university seals seemed to mock her fall from academic grace. It had happened with breathtaking speed. First came whispers of plagiarism in her groundbreaking paper on Mandarin dialectical variations, then accusations of data falsification. Claire remembered the faculty meeting where colleagues she'd trusted for years refused to meet her eyes as the university president announced her suspension pending investigation. They were looking for any reason, she whispered to the empty room. The truth was simple. A black woman rising too quickly in academia had threatened the established order. When the evidence against her was revealed as fabricated months later, it was too late. Her reputation was destroyed, her career unsalvageable. The academic journals that had once celebrated her work now refused her submissions. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. The mortgage on her small house went unpaid. Depression had wrapped around her like a shroud. Taking the name Claire Thompson had been an act of survival. She'd moved across the country, taken the first job available, housekeeping at the Hamilton estate. For 2 decades, she'd scrubbed floors, prepared meals, and raised Richard's children while their mother battled cancer. She'd become the perfect servant, efficient, invisible, forgotten. The irony wasn't lost on her that Richard Hamilton now held in his hands a document in the very language she had once mastered. The same skills that had once earned her academic acclaim would now be used to clean up another rich man's mess. Claire carefully returned the diploma to its hiding place. Tonight, she would reclaim a piece of herself that had been stolen. Dr. Michelle Carter would translate that document with perfect precision, not for Richard's amusement or reward, but because it was who she truly was. The kitchen's silence wrapped around Claire Thompson like a familiar shroud. Moonlight filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the granite countertops where she'd prepared countless meals for the Hamilton family. She stared at the Chinese dossier spread before her, each character a reminder of the life she once had, the respected academic career that had been violently torn away. 20 years of invisible service had taught Claire to swallow her pride, to fade into the background of the mansion's opulent rooms. But tonight, as she traced her fingers over the foreign script, something stirred within her, a flicker of the woman she used to be. Dr. Michelle Carter wouldn't have cowered. She would have risen to the challenge. "Perhaps this is my chance," she whispered to the empty kitchen. Richard Hamilton's cruel joke had inadvertently offered her something precious, an opportunity to reclaim a piece of her stolen dignity. Claire reached for her cell phone, hidden beneath a stack of dish towels. Her fingers hovered over the screen before typing a message to Jonathan Reed. In all these years of exile, Jonathan had been her only connection to her former life, the sole person who still called her Michelle in hushed private conversations. "I need your help with something urgent," she wrote. "It involves translation work, Chinese technical documents." The response came almost immediately. "Michelle, are you sure this is safe?" Claire smiled sadly. Jonathan, always worried about her, had begged her to fight the false accusations years ago instead of disappearing. "Nothing about my life is safe," she replied, "but this might be important." As she waited for Jonathan's response, Claire made herself a cup of tea, the ritual calming her nerves. The Hamilton mansion slept around her, its occupants oblivious to the transformation occurring in their kitchen. The woman who had raised their children, who had held Mrs. Hamilton's hand through chemotherapy, who had cleaned their messes without complaint, that woman was fading away, making room for the scholar who had once commanded lecture halls. Jonathan's message lit up her screen. "Send me what you have. We'll figure this out together." Claire's hands steadied as midnight approached. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 12 times, each resonant note strengthening her resolve. She would translate this document not just to humiliate Richard, but to prove to herself that Claire Thompson and Dr. Michelle Carter could coexist, that neither identity had been completely erased. As the last chime faded into silence, determination blazed within her like a fire too long banked, now roaring. Back to life with renewed purpose. Tomorrow would change everything. Claire spread the Chinese documents across her small table in the staff quarters, her fingers tracing characters she hadn't properly studied in years. The symbols that had once been second nature to her academic mind slowly awakened from dormancy. Each character felt like reconnecting with an old friend after a painful separation. As the night deepened, Claire Thompson worked methodically, her eyes burning from strain, yet alive with intellectual engagement. This was the first time in 20 years she'd exercised her linguistic expertise at this level. The technical jargon was dense, filled with specialized terminology about intellectual property and data security protocols that would have stumped most translators. But her mind, though rusty, remained razor-sharp. "Still got it," she whispered to herself, a small smile forming as she decoded particularly complex passages. Around 3 in the morning, something caught her attention. A clause buried deep. Within Section 17 contained unusual phrasing. She reread it, then checked the surrounding context. Her heart began to race. This wasn't standard contractual language. It was deliberately obscured predatory terms, disguised as routine legal formalities. "My God," she murmured, quickly flipping through other sections. More red flags appeared, clauses granting unprecedented access to Hamilton Technologies' proprietary algorithms, backdoor provisions for data extraction and complete transfer, of patent rights disguised as temporary licensing agreements. Claire grabbed her cell phone and messaged Jonathan Reed, the only person who still knew her as Dr. Michelle Carter. "Need your eyes on something urgent. Can you look at these sections?" She photographed the most concerning passages and sent them. Despite the hour, Jonathan responded within minutes. Their exchange grew increasingly alarming as he confirmed her suspicions. "This isn't just bad, Claire," he texted back. "This is catastrophic. If Hamilton signs this, his company is finished. Someone's orchestrating a complete takeover worth billions." Claire sat back, stunned. Richard Hamilton's cruel joke had accidentally revealed a corporate assassination attempt. The same man who had humiliated her might now lose everything because he couldn't be bothered to find proper translators for critical documents. She felt a momentary flash of satisfaction at the irony, but it quickly faded. Hundreds of employees would lose their livelihoods if Hamilton Technologies collapsed. Despite everything, she couldn't let that happen. "What should I do?" she asked Jonathan. His response was immediate. "Tell him everything, but be careful. Whoever crafted this trap won't appreciate you exposing it. These aren't people who play fair." Claire looked at the documents spread before her, understanding that her translation had just become far more dangerous than a simple challenge to her dignity. She was now holding evidence that could save or destroy an empire. Claire's blood ran cold as the realization hit her. The Chinese contract wasn't just a cruel joke or a test of her abilities. It was a deadly trap that could destroy Hamilton Technologies from within. She sat at her small kitchen table, the harsh fluorescent light illuminating the damning evidence she had uncovered. "This goes beyond me," she whispered to herself, fingers tracing the characters that concealed poison pills and ownership transfers. If Richard Hamilton signed this agreement, thousands of employees would lose their livelihoods. Families would suffer, lives would be upended. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Her phone buzzed with a message from Jonathan Reed. "You need to be extremely careful, Claire," he wrote. "People with this much money and power won't hesitate to protect their interests if they discover you know too much." Claire stared at the warning, her heart pounding. Jonathan was right. The stakes had escalated far beyond a personal challenge or her wounded pride. The people behind this contract would have contingency plans, and silencing a mere maid would hardly register as a moral dilemma for them. "What should I do?" she texted back, her fingers trembling slightly. His response came quickly. "Document everything, make copies, and watch your back." Claire looked around her modest quarters in the mansion's staff wing. For 20 years she had lived in this liminal space, present but invisible, hearing everything but acknowledged for nothing. Now that very invisibility might be her greatest asset. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. This wasn't just about reclaiming her dignity or revealing her past as Dr. Michelle Carter. This was about justice, about preventing a catastrophe that would affect countless innocent people. The maid stood up, straightening her back with newfound resolve. She was alone in this fight, vulnerable and unprotected against forces with unlimited resources. Running wasn't an option. She had been running for 20 years, and where had that gotten her? Hiding wasn't possible. She knew too much now. "Then I face it," Claire murmured, gathering the translated pages together. "I face them all." She carefully organized her notes, highlighting the most damning clauses, preparing her evidence. Tomorrow, she would walk into that boardroom not as Claire Thompson, the invisible maid, but as the woman she truly was. Brilliant, determined, and unbreakable. As dawn approached, she made her final preparations, knowing that the coming confrontation would either destroy her completely or finally set her free. The first rays of dawn filtered through the mansion's windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Claire Thompson had not slept, her tired eyes burning from hours of intense concentration. The Chinese contract lay before her, now fully translated and meticulously annotated with red warnings highlighting the dangerous clauses she had discovered. Her fingers trembled slightly as she organized the papers, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of what she had uncovered. These documents revealed a calculated trap that would strip Hamilton Technologies of its intellectual property and core security protocols. If Richard signed this agreement, everything he had built would crumble. Claire took a deep breath, steadying herself. After 20 years of invisibility, of being nothing more than furniture in the Hamilton household, she was about to step into the light. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Her phone buzzed with a message from Jonathan Reed. "Be careful," he warned. "People with billions at stake don't take kindly to threats." She knew he was right. The maid was stepping far beyond her station, challenging the very power structure that had kept her silent for decades. Yet the former professor within her, Dr. Michelle Carter, the woman she had once been, refused to stay hidden any longer. At precisely 8:30, Richard's voice echoed through the mansion's intercom system, summoning the board members to an emergency meeting. Claire gathered the translated documents, sliding them into a sleek folder she had borrowed from the study. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she changed from her maid's uniform into the only formal outfit she owned, a simple black dress she had worn to Richard's wife's funeral 3 years ago. The boardroom doors loomed before her, intimidating in their polished grandeur. Through the wood, she could hear Richard Hamilton's confident voice addressing his executives, likely assuring them that the Chinese contract would revolutionize their market position. Claire closed her eyes briefly, summoning the dignity and strength that had sustained her through years of academic excellence before her fall from grace. When she opened them again, her resolve was unbreakable. With steady, and she pushed open the heavy doors, the conversation inside died instantly. Every head turned, expressions ranging from confusion to disdain at the maid's unexpected intrusion. Richard's face darkened with irritation. Claire walked forward, her head held high, clutching the folder that contained either salvation or doom for the empire built on her invisibility. The silence in the room was absolute as she approached the boardroom table, ready to shatter 20 years of carefully maintained illusions. Richard Hamilton's smirk was unmistakable as Claire Thompson approached the boardroom table, translated, documents in hand. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows did nothing to warm the atmosphere as executives shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. "Well, well," Richard announced to the room, his voice dripping with condescension. "Our maid believes she's cracked what our team of experts couldn't." He accepted the papers with 2 fingers, as if touching something distasteful. "Let's humor her, shall we?" Several board members exchanged awkward glances, while Diane Sterling, the CFO, watched Claire with newfound curiosity. The black woman stood tall, despite the mockery, her dignity intact as she waited silently. Richard began scanning the first page, his performance of amusement continuing. "I must say, Claire, this is quite—" His voice faltered mid-sentence. The CEO's expression shifted dramatically as his eyes darted across the page, flipping rapidly to the next. "This can't be right," he muttered, color draining from his face. The boardroom fell utterly silent. Even the usual sounds of coffee cups and shuffling papers ceased. Richard's hands began to tremble slightly as he reached the 3rd page of annotations. "Richard?" Diane finally broke the silence. "What is it?" He couldn't answer, still absorbing the implications of what he was reading. Claire stepped forward, her voice calm but authoritative, nothing like the quiet, deferential tone they were accustomed to hearing from her. "The contract contains hidden clauses that transfer ownership of your core intellectual property to the Chinese firm," she explained. "Section 12 specifically grants them unlimited access to your security protocols. Section 17 nullifies your right to contest any patent infringements." The executives stared in disbelief, some reaching for copies to verify her claims. "This contract gives away your intellectual property and core security," Claire continued, addressing the entire board now. "If you sign, you lose everything. Hamilton Technologies would effectively become a shell within 6 months. Richard looked up at her, his arrogance replaced by naked fear. "How did you—" he began, but couldn't finish the question. One executive was already making frantic calls to legal. Another was checking the credentials of their translation team. Diane's eyes remained fixed on Claire, a mixture of respect and shock evident in her expression. The silence that followed was deafening, a room full of powerful people confronting not just a narrowly avoided catastrophe, but the uncomfortable reality that salvation had come from the person they'd all been trained to overlook. Richard Hamilton's face drained of color as the implications of Claire's translation sank in. His fingers trembled against the papers, crinkling their edges. The boardroom, usually filled with confident voices and strategic discussions, fell into a stunned silence. "This can't be right," he whispered, but the panic in his eyes betrayed his words. Diane Sterling reached for the documents, her practiced gaze scanning the pages Claire had meticulously annotated. The CFO's sharp intake of breath confirmed what everyone was beginning to realize. They had been moments away from corporate suicide. "She's right," Diane announced, her voice cutting through the tension. "These clauses would have given away our core patents and security protocols. How did our legal team miss this?" The board members exchanged horrified glances. Some turned accusatory eyes toward Richard, while others stared at Claire with newfound respect, tinged with shame. For 20 years, they had walked past her in hallways, handed her empty coffee cups, and never once considered that the woman who cleaned their offices might possess a mind sharper than their own. "I didn't miss it," Claire said quietly, standing, tall despite the weight of all eyes upon her, because I've seen contracts like this before. In my previous life. The room grew impossibly quieter as Claire Thompson straightened her shoulders and revealed the truth. Before I became your maid, I was Dr. Michelle Carter. I held a doctorate in linguistics with specialization in Asian languages and international business law from Harvard. I published 3 books on cross-cultural negotiation tactics. Richard's mouth fell open. The executive who had laughed at her just yesterday now looked like he might be sick. A scandal destroyed my career 20 years ago, she continued, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. False accusations of plagiarism. My research was stolen, my reputation ruined. No university would touch me. No company would hire me. Diane's eyes widened in recognition. I remember that case. It was all over academic circles. Claire nodded. When you have no options left, you take what work you can find, and you become invisible. The weight of decades of prejudice and arrogance crashed down upon the room. Board members shifted uncomfortably in their expensive chairs, unable to meet her gaze. So yes, Mr. Hamilton, Claire concluded, her dignity radiating through the boardroom, I can translate your document, and I just saved your billion-dollar empire from collapse. Richard Hamilton's voice faltered as he stood before Claire Thompson, his imposing figure suddenly diminished. The boardroom, with its polished mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows, had never felt so small. The CEO's hands trembled slightly as he struggled to form words, his usual confidence shattered like fine crystal against concrete. I don't know what to say, he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. You've saved us all from disaster. If you hadn't caught this... He gestured helplessly at the translated document spread across the table. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, avoiding eye contact with the woman they'd overlooked for 2 decades. Diane Sterling, the CFO, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of admiration for Claire and disappointment in her colleagues. Thank you isn't enough, Richard continued, his voice gaining strength but losing arrogance with each word. What you've done for Hamilton Technologies today? Claire raised her hand, silencing him mid-sentence. The simple gesture commanded more respect than any shouted order ever could. Don't thank me, she said, her voice steady and clear. Just remember never to judge someone by their skin or station. Her eyes swept across the room, meeting each gaze unflinchingly. The woman who cleans your office might have saved your life once. The man who drives your car might have written books you've studied. We are all more than what you see. Richard nodded slowly, the weight of 20 years of dismissal and disregard settling on his shoulders. For the first time, he truly saw the woman before him, not as Claire the maid, but as Dr. Michelle Carter, a brilliant mind he'd relegated to dusting his shelves and washing his dishes. I understand, he said, though they both knew he was only beginning to. Claire gathered her notes with deliberate care, her movements unhurried and dignified. She straightened her simple blouse and walked toward the door, her footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. As she reached the threshold, she paused and turned. Back, the morning light from the windows illuminated her face, highlighting the quiet strength that had always been there, waiting to be recognized. Your company is safe now, she said simply. The rest is up to you. The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded like the final note of a symphony. In her wake, she left a room full of powerful people confronting their own prejudices for perhaps the first time. For the first time in 20 years, Claire wasn't invisible. She wasn't just the maid anymore. She was the savior of their empire. Richard Hamilton slumped in his leather chair, the weight of his near-catastrophic mistake crushing him like a physical force. The boardroom had emptied, but the echoes of shock and disbelief still hung in the air. He ran his fingers through his silver-streaked hair, confronting the reality that his billion-dollar empire had stood at the precipice of destruction, saved not by his highly paid experts, but by the woman who had cleaned his office for 20 years. "You look like a man who's seen his own ghost," Diane Sterling said, closing the boardroom door behind her. The CFO's sharp eyes missed nothing as she took the seat across from him. "Care to explain how we nearly signed away everything because you were too busy mocking the only person who could actually read Mandarin?" Richard winced. "I've made a terrible mistake." "One mistake?" Diane leaned forward. "Richard, that woman has worked in your home for 2 decades. She raised your children. She cared for Elizabeth during her illness. And in all that time, you never once bothered to learn who she really was." The truth of Diane's words stung, worse than any financial loss could have. Images flashed through his mind. Claire quietly collecting dishes while he hosted lavish parties. Claire helping his daughter with homework when he was too busy. Claire holding his wife's hand during chemotherapy, when meetings kept him away. "My God," he whispered. "I didn't see her. I just didn't see her." "None of us did," Diane admitted, her voice softening slightly. "But you set the tone. When you treated her as invisible, we all followed suit." Outside the glass walls of the boardroom, executives huddled in small groups, their glances toward Richard a mixture of confusion and judgment. The company had nearly fallen because of prejudice. His prejudice. "Dr. Michelle Carter," Richard said the name slowly, testing the weight of it. "A renowned linguist, and I had her folding my laundry." Diane nodded. "The question is, what are you going to do about it now?" Richard stared at the contract on the table, the document that Claire had translated and annotated with meticulous care, saving them all. He thought about the casual cruelty of his challenge, the laughter it had provoked, the humiliation he had inflicted. "I need to make this right," he said finally, "not just with Claire but with everyone. This company," he gestured around him, "needs to change. I need to change." Diane studied him carefully. "That's going to take more than an apology and a bonus check, Richard." "I know." He stood up, determination replacing shame. "But I have to start somewhere, and I think I know exactly where that is." Richard Hamilton found Claire in the kitchen that evening, standing by the window where she'd spent countless hours watching life unfold in the mansion's sprawling gardens. The CEO's footsteps were hesitant, lacking their usual confident stride. The boardroom confrontation had stripped away his armor of arrogance, leaving behind a man forced to face the consequences of his actions. "Claire," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Gone was the commanding tone that had directed billion-dollar deals. "I need to speak with you." Claire Thompson turned slowly, her posture dignified despite the apron still tied around her waist. Her eyes, which had witnessed 20 years of the Hamilton family's intimate moments, held a quiet strength that made Richard look away first. "I owe you an apology," he began, "not just for last night's humiliation, but for 2 decades of not seeing you." 20 years, Claire replied, her voice steady. "I've worked in this house for 20 years, Mr. Hamilton. I bathed your children when they were sick. I held your wife's hand through chemotherapy when you were too busy with meetings. I've heard every family secret, wiped away every tear, celebrated every milestone, always in the background, always invisible." Richard winced at each word, each one cutting deeper than the last. "When Sarah was afraid before her first day of high school," Claire continued, "it wasn't you she came to. When Michael struggled with his college applications, I was the one who stayed up all night helping him. When your wife needed someone to talk to during her final months, I was there, not as the help, but as the only person who would truly listen." The kitchen fell silent, except for the soft ticking of the clock, the same clock Claire had dusted every week for 2 decades without complaint. "All those years," Richard said, his voice breaking, "I never asked about your life, your dreams. I never even wondered who you were beyond these walls." Claire's eyes didn't waver. "No, you didn't. You saw a uniform, not a person. You saw a service, not a human being with her own history and pain." Richard's shoulders slumped as the weight of his blindness settled upon them. The man who commanded a corporate empire couldn't meet the gaze of the woman who had silently built the foundation of his personal life. "I'm truly sorry, Claire," he said finally. "I know words aren't enough. Nothing can give you back those years of being unseen." Claire nodded, neither accepting nor rejecting his apology. The kitchen remained quiet, the space between them filled. With 20 years of unacknowledged truth, Richard Hamilton stood in the kitchen doorway, his imposing frame somehow diminished by the weight of his remorse. The polished veneer of corporate confidence had cracked, revealing a man confronting decades of his own blindness. "I know words aren't enough, Claire," he said, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone. "But I need you to know my apology is sincere." Claire Thompson looked up from the counter where she'd been preparing tea, her expression carefully neutral. 20 years of practiced composure hadn't abandoned her, even now. "You're right, Richard. Words aren't enough," she replied. "I don't want your guilt or your shame. I want change, real, lasting change. Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been invisible in your world." The CEO shifted uncomfortably. "What would that look like?" "It means examining every policy at Hamilton Technologies. It means looking at who you hire, who you promote, whose voices you value," Claire said, her words measured but firm. "It means acknowledging that what happened with me isn't isolated. It's systemic." Richard nodded slowly. "I promise you, I'll transform this company. We'll root out prejudice wherever it exists. Everyone deserves dignity, regardless of their position." Claire studied his face, searching for insincerity. For the first time since she'd known him, she saw genuine understanding dawning in his eyes. "This isn't just about corporate policy," she continued. "It's about you, Richard, how you see people, how you treat the person cleaning your office versus the person sitting across from you in the boardroom." "I understand," he said quietly. "I've been blind, Claire, not just yesterday, but for 20 years. You raised my children. You cared for Elizabeth during her illness. You've been more family than employee, yet I never truly saw you." Claire felt something shift inside her, not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of healing. "I accept your apology," she said finally. "Not just for myself, but for everyone who's ever suffered under your blind privilege. For the janitors you've never greeted, the assistants whose names you've forgotten, the countless others who've been rendered invisible." Richard straightened his shoulders, determination replacing shame. "I won't let you down, Claire. I promise." "Don't promise me," she replied. "Prove it. Every day, in every interaction, with every decision you make." As he nodded and turned to leave, Claire realized this moment wasn't just about personal vindication. It was about creating ripples that might eventually become waves. Changing, not just one man or one company, but perhaps something much larger. $500,000 as promised, Richard Hamilton said, sliding a check across the polished mahogany table between them. The office was quiet now, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous days. Claire Thompson stared at the check, her fingers not moving to take it. "I don't want your charity, Mr. Hamilton." "This isn't charity," Richard insisted, his voice lacking the commanding tone he typically used in this room. "This is honoring a deal I made thinking you couldn't possibly succeed." He paused, the weight of his misjudgment visible in the new lines on his face. "I was wrong, Claire. Catastrophically wrong." She studied the CEO's expression, searching for any hint of condescension or pity. Instead, she found only genuine remorse, something she'd never expected to see from the man who had treated her as invisible for 20 years. "The money feels wrong," Claire said finally, "like you're paying to ease your conscience." Richard ran a hand through his graying hair. "Perhaps I am, but that doesn't make it any less yours by right." He leaned forward. "You saved this company, Claire. You saved thousands of jobs. My conscience isn't worth $500,000, but your expertise certainly is." Claire's fingers brushed against the check, but still didn't take it. The sum represented more money than she'd seen in the 2 decades since losing her academic career. "I have another proposition," Richard continued when she remained silent. "Hamilton Technologies needs someone with your linguistic abilities and attention to detail. I'm offering you a senior leadership position overseeing our international contracts division." Claire's eyes widened. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious," he replied. "Your expertise as Dr. Michelle Carter shouldn't be wasted. In my kitchen, it should be shaping the future of this company." The mention of her true name, her true self, sent a shiver through Claire. For years that identity had been buried, a ghost she'd tried to forget. "The board would never accept it," she said quietly. "They already have," Richard countered. "After what happened, no one's in a position to object." Diane was particularly supportive. Claire finally picked up the check, folding it carefully. "I'll consider the position," she said, her voice steady, despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "But on my terms, not as some token gesture." Richard nodded, understanding that this moment represented not just a job offer, but the beginning of something much more profound, a reckoning long overdue. Claire pushed the document across Richard Hamilton's desk with steady hands. It wasn't a request, but a declaration of terms, her conditions for accepting the position he'd offered. "My safety must be guaranteed," she said, her voice calm but firm. "There will be people who resent my promotion. I need to know you'll stand behind me when they push back." Richard nodded, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine respect. The man who had once seen her only as the help now looked at her as an equal. "And I need flexibility," Claire continued. "I've spent 20 years confined to this mansion, my schedule dictated by your family's needs. That changes now." "Of course," Richard agreed, scanning the document. His brow furrowed when he reached the final condition. "A public commitment to eradicate racism from the company culture." "That's non-negotiable," Claire said. "What happened to me wasn't just about one man's prejudice. It's systemic. Your entire executive team sat in that room and laughed when you mocked me." Richard winced at the memory, shame coloring his features. "You're right, and it stops now." "Words aren't enough," Claire replied. "I want diversity initiatives with real teeth, mandatory training, transparent hiring practices, and consequences for discriminatory behavior, no matter who's responsible." The CEO leaned back in his leather chair, studying the woman before him. Not Claire Thompson, the maid, but Dr. Michelle Carter, the brilliant linguist who had saved his company from disaster. "You know this won't be easy," he said finally. "Some of the old guard won't accept these changes." "Then they can find employment elsewhere," Claire answered without hesitation. "Hamilton Technologies can't move forward if it's anchored to outdated prejudices." Richard stood and extended his hand across the desk. "I agree to your terms, all of them, not because I owe you, though I do, but because you're right. Real change has to start from the top." Claire rose and accepted his handshake, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about her vindication or his redemption. It was about transforming a corporate culture that had allowed people like her to remain invisible for too long. "I'll announce your appointment at tomorrow's all-hands meeting," Richard said, "and my commitment to your initiatives." As Claire left the office, she felt a strange lightness. For 20 years she had moved through these halls like a ghost. Now, with each step, she reclaimed not just her identity, but her power to create meaningful change. With that handshake, a new era had begun, not just for Claire Thompson, but for Hamilton Technologies itself. The executive boardroom at Hamilton Technologies had transformed in the months since Claire Thompson's promotion. Where once only white men in tailored suits had sat, now diversity flourished. But not everyone celebrated this new direction. David Walker, a longtime executive who had enjoyed Richard Hamilton's favor for 15 years, watched his influence waning with barely concealed resentment. "She's been here 5 minutes and suddenly she's running international contracts." David muttered to his inner circle after a particularly successful presentation by Claire. The woman was cleaning toilets last year. In the shadows of the company's gleaming headquarters, David and 4 loyal executives formed an unofficial resistance. They began with subtle sabotage, accidentally excluding Claire from critical email chains, scheduling meetings during her known appointments with international clients, and questioning her decisions in front of the board. I just wonder if someone with Dr. Thompson's unique background fully understands the complexities of Asian markets, David would say, his voice dripping with false concern. Claire noticed everything but refused to be baited. When excluded from emails, she would arrive at meetings impeccably prepared anyway. When appointments conflicted, she would send comprehensive briefing documents that impressed clients more than in-person meetings. Each challenge became an opportunity to demonstrate her exceptional capabilities. The rumors came next. Whispers spread through the company cafeteria that Claire had blackmailed Richard, that she wasn't really qualified, that she was sleeping with someone in leadership. Diane Sterling, the CFO who had become Claire's ally, reported these rumors directly to her. "They're trying to break you," Diane warned during a private lunch. "David's terrified of what you represent." Claire simply nodded. "Let my work speak for itself." And it did. While David's faction plotted, Claire closed a deal with a Japanese technology firm that had resisted Hamilton Technology's advances. For 7 years, she mediated a contract dispute in Brazil that saved the company millions. Her department's productivity increased by 38% in just 1 quarter. Richard, watching this unfold, called David into his office after hearing about the latest rumor campaign. "This stops now," the CEO said firmly. "Claire saved this company when none of us could. She's earned her place here." David left the meeting seething. That night he gathered his allies in his corner office overlooking the city lights. "We need something bigger," he told them, his face hard with determination. "Something that will prove she doesn't belong here once and for all." As they plotted, none of them noticed Jonathan Reed walking past the glass-walled office, catching just enough of their conversation to alert Claire that the real battle was only beginning. Claire Thompson's reputation at Hamilton Technologies grew with each passing month. She closed 3 record-breaking international deals that competitors had deemed impossible, and resolved a decade-long patent dispute that had drained company resources for years. The younger employees, particularly those from diverse backgrounds, found in her a mentor and inspiration. "Dr. Carter's approach to the Singapore negotiation was brilliant," whispered one junior executive to another, using Claire's former academic title, which had gradually returned to common usage around the office. But while Claire's star rose, David Walker watched from the shadows, his resentment festering. The long-time executive couldn't stomach taking direction from someone he still viewed as the help, regardless of her credentials or achievements. In his corner office, David gathered his most loyal allies. "She's making us look incompetent," he hissed to 3 other executives. "Hamilton's forgotten who built this company while he's busy with his diversity project." They nodded in agreement, and their plan took shape. Sabotage the upcoming $100 million contract with a Japanese technology firm, a deal Claire had personally cultivated for months, and ensure the blame fell squarely on her shoulders. Late one evening, when the office stood nearly empty, David accessed Claire's files through his administrative privileges. With meticulous precision, he altered key terms in the contract draft, changing delivery dates, modifying intellectual property clauses, and inserting penalty provisions that would make the deal toxic to both parties. "Let's see the professor translate her way out of this mess," he smirked to himself, carefully covering his digital tracks. But Claire hadn't survived 20 years of invisibility without developing keen instincts. Reviewing the final documents, the next morning, she noticed subtle inconsistencies in formatting that triggered her suspicion. She immediately called Jonathan Reed. "Something's wrong with these documents," she explained. "The language shifted in Section 12. It's almost imperceptible, but it's there." Jonathan suggested running a document comparison against earlier versions. Claire's blood ran cold as she discovered the sabotage, changes that would have bankrupted a division of Hamilton Technologies while making her appear incompetent or corrupt. Working through the night, she restored the original terms while implementing a digital trap. When David accessed the files again to check his handiwork, his electronic signature was captured. Claire methodically gathered server logs, access records, and timestamp data, building an airtight case. As dawn broke, she organized the evidence into a presentation, her hands steady despite her exhaustion. This confrontation wouldn't just determine her future at Hamilton Technologies. It would reveal whether Richard Hamilton's commitment to change was genuine or merely performative. The boardroom fell into a charged silence as Claire Thompson stood at the head of the table, her posture unwavering. The emergency meeting had been called with barely an hour's notice, and the tension was palpable as executive eyes darted between her and the evidence displayed on the projection screen. These timestamps show unauthorized alterations to the Nakamura contract, Claire explained, her voice steady as she scrolled through highlighted sections. The changes would have cost Hamilton Technologies $100 million and likely our entire Asian market presence. Richard Hamilton leaned forward, his face ashen. "And you're certain about the source?" Claire nodded, pulling up the digital trail she'd meticulously documented. "The system logs show all modifications came from this IP address," she said, pointing to a string of numbers. "It belongs to David Walker's office computer." David shot to his feet, his face contorted with rage. "This is absurd. She's fabricating evidence to discredit me." "The timestamps don't lie, David," Diane Sterling interjected, the CFO's analytical mind already processing the implications. "Neither do the backup servers that automatically archive every version." Claire maintained her composure as she presented the final piece of evidence. Security footage showing David entering the server room after hours, precisely when the contract alterations were made. The room fell deathly quiet. Richard stood slowly, the weight of realization visible in his posture. The CEO who had once mocked Claire now looked at her with profound respect. "David Walker, you're terminated. Effective immediately," Richard announced, his voice cutting through the silence. "Security will escort you from the building." As David was led away, hurling threats and accusations, the board members sat stunned. One by one they turned to Claire, with expressions ranging from shame to admiration. "I owe you an apology," said one board member who had previously questioned her promotion. "We all do." Richard addressed the room. "What happened today goes beyond one man's actions. It exposes the rot we've allowed to fester." He turned to Claire. "The reforms you've been advocating, diversity training, blind hiring practices, mentorship programs, consider them approved." Claire nodded, feeling the weight of 20 years lifting from her shoulders. This victory wasn't just about exposing David's sabotage. It represented something far more significant, acknowledgement of her worth and a commitment to systemic change. As the meeting adjourned, Diane approached Claire. "You know this is just the beginning," she said quietly. "I do," Claire replied, "but it's a beginning I never thought I'd see." The boardroom emptied, leaving Claire alone with her thoughts. From invisible maid to the company's moral compass, her journey had come full circle, not in vengeance, but in justice. 1 year later, the gleaming glass headquarters of Hamilton Technologies stood as a testament to transformation. Claire Thompson walked through the executive floor, her confident stride a stark contrast to the invisible steps she had taken for 20 years as a maid. Employees smiled and nodded respectfully as the senior director passed by, many stopping to consult with her on international contracts and cultural initiatives. The nameplate on her office door read, "Dr. Michelle Carter Thompson, a deliberate fusion of her past and present identities. Claire had reclaimed her academic credentials while honoring the woman she had become through years of resilience. Inside her spacious office, floor-to-ceiling windows replaced the kitchen walls that had once confined her world. Richard Hamilton knocked gently before entering, a habit that symbolized their new relationship built on mutual respect. The CEO had undergone his own transformation, the arrogance that once defined him replaced by thoughtful humility. "The diversity report is ready for the board meeting," he said, placing a folder on her desk. "Your mentorship program has increased minority leadership by 38%. Claire nodded, remembering the kitchen where she'd translated the Chinese contract that saved the company. "Numbers matter, but culture matters more. How's the scholarship foundation coming along?" "Jonathan Reed has agreed to chair it," Richard replied. "He believes your story will inspire linguistic students for generations." The mention of her old friend brought a smile to Claire's face. Jonathan had stood by her through everything, and now served as a trusted advisor to the company's educational initiatives. Outside her window, Diane Sterling crossed the courtyard with a group of new hires. The CFO had become Claire's strongest ally in reshaping corporate policies, challenging old prejudices with the same directness she once used to confront Richard. Later that afternoon, Claire addressed the company's annual meeting. The boardroom where she had once been mocked now fell silent as she spoke about dignity, opportunity, and the cost of prejudice. Richard sat beside her, nodding as she outlined their vision for the future. "True change," Claire concluded, "isn't measured in statements or statistics, but in how we see each other's humanity." As applause filled the room, Claire's gaze fell on the empty chair once occupied by David Walker. His dismissal had sent a powerful message throughout the industry about accountability and justice. That evening, as Claire gathered her things to leave, she paused at her nameplate, running her fingers across the embossed letters. It represented more than a title or position. It stood as a symbol of resilience, dignity, and the power to transform a world built on prejudice with truth, courage, and unbreakable self-respect.